Sofia never thought that morning would be her last. One moment, she was reaching for a glass of water. The next, everything went black. But death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. From above, she saw her own body lying still. A force pulled her into a vast darkness where eerie whispers filled the void. Fear gripped her until suddenly a brilliant light shattered the abyss. Jesus stood before her, and what he revealed about the future and the mark would change everything. For most of my life, I never imagined I would be telling this story. My name is Sofia. I once lived a life of quiet devotion, far removed from the world's chaos. I had dedicated myself fully to God, taking my vows as a nun at a young age. My days were spent in prayer, service, and solitude, seeking only to draw closer to Christ. Outside the convent, life moved at a relentless pace. But within those walls, I found purpose. Caring for the poor, tending to the sick, and praying for lost souls. I never doubted my calling. I trusted God to guide my path, believing He had placed me exactly where I was meant to be. My life was simple, without wealth, ambition, or power. None of it mattered to me. Only faith did. But everything changed that day. If someone had told me I would die and return with an urgent message, I would have dismissed the idea without hesitation. I had read about near-death experiences before, but they felt distant. Stories that happened to others, never to me. Yet that morning, the unthinkable happened. It started with a weakness I couldn't explain. For days, my body had felt heavy, my breaths short. I brushed it off, assuming it was exhaustion from fasting and long hours of prayer. I had always pushed my body in devotion, trusting that God would sustain me. That morning was no different. I rose before dawn as I had for years, while the rain tapped against my small window. The air was cold and damp. I reached for my Bible, but my hands trembled. A strange numbness crept through my fingers. I dismissed it and stood, but my legs wavered beneath me. Something was wrong. I just needed water, a moment to steady myself. But as I reached for the glass beside my bed, my vision blurred. The room swayed. A crushing weight pressed against my chest, stealing my breath. The glass slipped from my grasp, shattering on the floor. The world around me began to fade. I tried to hold on, gripping the wooden table, but my strength failed me. My legs buckled. The last thing I remember was the cold floor against my skin, the sound of hurried footsteps, and a voice, urgent, muffled, calling my name. Then, nothing. Just darkness. In that instant, the life I had known was over, but my journey had only begun. The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything. No pain, no breath, no weight, only stillness. For a fleeting moment, I thought I was dreaming, caught in that strange space between sleep and wakefulness. But as awareness crept in, the truth became clear. I was no longer in my body. From above, I saw myself lying motionless on the cold stone floor, my robes pooled around me, my skin unnervingly pale. My lips were slightly parted, as if I had tried to speak just before I fell. But my chest did not rise. I wasn't breathing. Then, a voice. Elena, I realized. My neighbor. Her frantic cries shattered the silence. Oh, dear Lord! Someone! Please! Help! She stood in the doorway, her face drained of color, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. I knew I should have felt something. Panic, urgency, the desperate need to call out and tell her I was still here. But I didn't. Instead, an eerie calm settled over me, as if I were merely an observer in someone else's story. I tried to move, to step forward, but I had no feet, No hands, no form to reach out with, and yet I was aware, more aware than I had ever been. Then, something unseen took hold of me. It wasn't hands gripping me, but a force, an invisible current tugging at the core of my being, pulling me upward. I had no control, no way to resist. Weightless, I ascended effortlessly. My room, the shattered glass, Elena's cries, they all faded below me. I passed through the ceiling as if it wasn't there, rising higher and higher into something vast and unfamiliar. Then, the world I knew vanished entirely. Darkness enveloped me, not the quiet darkness of night, nor the soft dimness of a candle flickering out. This was something deeper, heavier, almost alive. It surrounded me, stretched infinitely in every direction, pressing against me like an endless void. At first, there was silence. Then came the whispers. They started as distant murmurs, soft, almost mournful, but they grew louder, overlapping, multiplying. The voices carried sorrow, regret, and something far worse, despair. Some cried out in anguish, others pleaded, some raged in fury. I tried to turn to see where the voices came from, but there was no direction here. I was suspended in nothingness, a soul without a body, a mind without form. A dreadful realization took hold of me. Could this be hell? Was I under judgment? I had devoted my life to God through prayer and service, yet I was far from perfect. I had doubted, questioned, and failed. Was that why I was here condemned? The thought sent a shiver of fear through me, and in response the voices around me grew more insistent. The darkness deepened, gathering like a storm ready to break. I longed to scream, but I had no voice. I wanted to run, yet I had no legs. Then, from the void's depths, something stirred. It wasn't a person or even a clear shape, it was a presence. Vast, overwhelming, and suffocating. I could feel it watching me. Even though I saw nothing, the soft whispers escalated into anguished wails, and terror seized me. "Dear God, help me," I silently pleaded. Then, I noticed a light. At first, it was a faint glimmer, no larger than a distant star, yet it cut through the darkness with such force that even the shadows seemed to recoil. In that instant, the voices faltered and the oppressive presence paused. The light began to swell, expanding outward and drenching me in a wave of golden warmth. The darkness seemed to scream as unseen chains around me shattered. The light drew nearer, and I realized I was no longer alone. Someone, something, was coming for me. In that moment I understood I was being rescued. The light engulfed me, burning away the shadows that had threatened to consume me. A warmth unlike anything I'd ever known flooded every part of my being. The sorrowful whispers faded into a profound stillness. Then I saw him. At first, he was merely a distant silhouette standing at the center of the radiant glow. As he approached, I felt an indescribable presence, both powerful and tender. His very essence radiated love, sorrow, and something else, urgency. Jesus. The moment our eyes met, every fiber of my being recognized him. He wasn't just a man or a teacher. He was the Alpha and the Omega, the living God. His eyes, deep and piercing, carried the weight of eternity, yet they shone with compassion. As he looked at me, I sank to my knees, not by choice, but because I could do nothing else. In his presence, all that I had ever known paled in comparison. Every bit of my past, my prayers and sacrifices, felt like nothing more than a soft murmur against the overwhelming majesty of his glory. For what seemed like an eternity, I couldn't utter a word, though I soon realized that words weren't needed. He understood everything about me. At last, he reached out, and his voice, tender yet unyielding, resonated deep within my soul. "See for yourself," he said. With those words, the light around us shifted and the comforting warmth faded. In an instant, I was no longer standing before him. I found myself in a completely different place. A sprawling city, gleaming with towering buildings, flickering lights, and crowds of people moving in an almost hypnotic synchronization. Everything was neat, efficient, and rigidly controlled. At first glance, the scene appeared serene. But as I observed more closely, I noticed subtle details, the robotic pace of the people's walk, their expressions void of any real emotion. Their movements were mechanical, as if something essential had been stripped away. Then I saw it. A tiny mark, barely noticeable, placed on either the right hand or the forehead. It was everywhere, in billboards, digital screens, and at glowing kiosks, where people scanned their hands to enter buildings, purchase food, or catch transportation. No one questioned it, no one resisted. The realization hit me like a jolt of icy water. This wasn't merely a political system or an economic strategy, it was something much deeper. The mark wasn't forced upon them, they accepted it willingly. By embracing it, they had relinquished something priceless, something eternal. Jesus' voice rang out again inside me, laced with sorrow, yet firm. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. His words settled over me like a heavy shroud. I understood then that the people in this vision had chosen the mark, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of hunger, of rejection, of losing their place in the world. Then the scene changed. I now saw those who had refused the mark. They weren't part of the gleaming metropolis. They were the outcasts. I saw a mother in a bustling marketplace, her children clinging to her side. She offered a handful of cash for bread, but the vendor simply shook his head and pointed to a scanner. Lacking the mark, she was denied the right to buy. Tears welled in her eyes as she gathered her children and left empty-handed. I also witnessed a man in a hospital pleading desperately for medicine for his wife, only to be met with a doctor's sorrowful shake of the head. No mark meant no service. I saw entire families being forced from their homes, left to wander the streets simply because they refused to comply. And then I saw the hunters. These were the ones assigned to track down the unmarked and haul them off to re-education centers. They weren't soldiers, just neighbors, friends, even family members. The world had turned against them. Society branded them as dangerous extremists, obstacles to progress. It wasn't just persecution, it was a complete denial of their right to exist. Then the vision shifted again, and I witnessed those who had accepted the mark. At first, they appeared the same, but when I looked into their eyes, I saw only emptiness. It began subtly, a dullness, a lack of light, but over time, they became hollow. Their emotions faded, the love for their families vanished. I saw a woman who once cradled her infant with tenderness, now turning away, as if the child were nothing. I saw a husband dismiss his wife, who had refused the mark, as if she were a stranger. They had sacrificed something far more precious than their freedom. They had surrendered their souls. The vision dissolved, and suddenly I was standing before Jesus again. My heart pounded and tears stung my eyes. I wanted to beg him to undo it all, to stop this from happening, to change what I had seen. But his eyes were filled with sorrow as he said, "It has already begun." I tried to protest, but he raised his hand. "Tell them," he commanded, his voice like thunder yet full of love. "Warn them, time is short." I could barely speak, but I asked, "How will they survive without the mark?" His gaze softened. "The world will say they have no choice, but I will provide." In that moment, I realized this was not merely a fight for survival. It was a test, a final, eternal decision. The mark wasn't just a tool of control, it was an act of spiritual submission. Then, the vision began to fade as the light around him grew blinding. I felt myself being pulled back towards something familiar, something painful, something human. I gasped, and I awoke. Yet the vision did not end. Even as the image of the hollow-eyed masses faded, I was drawn into another scene. This time, the world looked different, darker, colder. The very air felt heavier, thick with silent oppression. But this wasn't the city of the marked. This was where the unmarked had been driven. I saw them, men, women, children, the ones who had refused the mark. They were dispersed everywhere, wandering empty streets, huddled in deserted buildings, and hiding deep in forests and mountains, far from prying eyes. Their clothes were threadbare, and their faces gaunt from hunger, yet in their eyes burned a spark that the marked had long lost. I witnessed a man, once a respected doctor, now scavenging for scraps in trash piles, his name erased and his credentials stripped away. I saw a young woman, formerly a teacher, sitting outside a long-abandoned church, clutching a small Bible as her fingers trembled under the faint glow of the moon. I saw an elderly couple, once surrounded by their children and grandchildren, now isolated after their own family turned them in, branding them dangerous for refusing the mark. The world had cast them aside. Society had declared that they no longer deserved to exist. At first, those who resisted the mark tried to blend into the cities, hoping to survive unnoticed. But the system allowed no neutrality. Without the mark, they were quickly identified. They couldn't buy food, rent a home, or receive medical care. Banks froze their accounts, and employers dismissed them. They became ghosts, forced out of society. Many fled, and I saw small groups forming in the wilderness, hidden communities of believers. They gathered in forests, on mountain slopes, and in underground hideouts, places where they wouldn't be found. They had no modern comforts, no electricity, no stores, no hospitals, yet they held fast to their faith. Then something extraordinary happened. I watched a man kneel by the dry, cracked earth, his hands raised in prayer. Behind him, his family stood with faces etched in hunger. They hadn't eaten in days. In a trembling voice, he prayed, "Lord, you fed Elijah in the wilderness. You gave manna to the Israelites. You are the same God." As his words quivered in the night, something stirred in the barren ground. Before their eyes, plants began to sprout. Vines, heavy with fruit and roots that dug deep and strong. Food appeared where there had been nothing. I then saw another group taking shelter in a cave, gathered around a child burning with fever. With no medicine at hand, a woman gently placed her hands on the child's forehead, tears falling silently. "Jesus, you healed the sick. You made the blind see. If we cannot turn to the world, we turn to you." At her plea, the child gasped, and his fever vanished in an instant. Yet not everyone held steadfast. Some wavered, hesitating in the face of such desperate hope. I saw a man, once steadfast in his faith, now trembling as he clutched his starving daughter. "How can I let her suffer?" he whispered. "Surely God would understand if I took the mark just to feed her." Tears filled his eyes as he looked to his wife, silently pleading for her agreement. But she only shook her head. "If we lose everything but keep our souls, we have lost nothing. But if we gain the world and lose our souls, then we've lost everything." Torn, the man turned away, wrestling with his decision. Some would hold on to their faith, while others would give in. Then Jesus' words echoed within me. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. Next, Jesus revealed one final vision. I saw a woman standing amid the ruins of a small town. Once wealthy, powerful, a true leader among her people, she now had nothing. Facing a government official, she was offered one last chance. "Take the mark And you can have your life back. Food, shelter, a home. You don't have to suffer anymore." She hesitated. Her hands trembled. Then, with quiet resolve, she looked the official in the eyes and shook her head. "My life is not my own." I witnessed the cost of her choice as she was led away. Yet even as she departed, her face radiated a serene light. I knew she had not been abandoned. She had been chosen. The vision faded, and once more I stood before Jesus. His eyes brimmed with sorrow, yet they held a glimmer of hope. The scene shifted again, and I found myself in the heart of a vast city, a place that no longer resembled the world I once knew. Everything was clear, clean, and orderly, efficient beyond measure. Digital screens displayed messages of unity, progress, and peace. People moved in perfect synchronization, their faces blank and eyes devoid of light. This was the new world, a world where everyone had accepted the mark. At first glance, it seemed peaceful, no crime, no conflict. But as I looked closer, I began to see the true nature of that peace. Peace had arrived, but at a dreadful price. These people were no longer themselves. I watched as a mother passed by, a little child huddled in the corner of an alley. The boy, his face streaked with dirt and his small hands reaching out, whispered, "Mama!" Yet she kept moving, not even pausing to recognize him. She had taken the mark. Her love, her very soul, had vanished. The scene shifted, and I found myself at a remote outpost, far from the cities where the unmarked had gathered. These were the last of those who refused to submit. Living in hiding, scavenging for scraps, they awaited the inevitable. Then the day came. I saw soldiers advancing in tight, perfect formation, their faces unreadable and their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Behind them stood a man in a suit, calm, composed, with a voice both smooth and almost kind. "We don't want to hurt you," he said. "We want to help you. The world has moved on. You don't have to suffer anymore." But no one moved. Then came the final temptation. The man gestured toward a group of children, frail and hungry, their ribs visible beneath tattered clothing. "Think of your children," he said softly. "Is your pride worth their suffering? Give them a future. Let them eat. Let them live." Some parents wept, their hands trembling. Others stepped forward. I saw a woman, holding a starving baby, sobbing as she whispered, "Forgive me." And then she took the mark. Her husband reached out for her. But the moment she accepted it, something in her changed. She turned away from him, her eyes growing cold. She no longer saw him, no longer cared. Yet there were others who refused. They stood together, weary but unshaken, hands clasped in silent prayer. One gaunt man stepped forward, not to surrender but to speak. "You cannot take what belongs to God," he declared. "We have already made our choice." The suited man sighed. "So be it." Then the soldiers raised their weapons, and the sky split open. A brilliant light, more dazzling than the sun and more vivid than life itself, cascaded down. The soldiers staggered, shielding their eyes from its intensity, while the unmarked stood resolute, their faces aglow, and their burden seemingly lifted. Jesus had arrived. In that moment, the vision shattered. A force far more powerful than anything I'd ever known yanked me backward, pulling me through layers of searing light and impenetrable darkness. I felt as if I were free falling, tumbling through eternity, rushing back towards something familiar, something heavy, then crashing into pain. A sharp gasp tore from my lungs as air rushed in, and my chest ached with each beat. My limbs grew weak, and suddenly, my fragile human body was mine once more. I was back. Then I heard an urgent, desperate voice. "Sofia, oh thank God. Stay with me," it pleaded. It was Elena, her hands gripping mine, tears streaking down her face. The room spun around me, my vision blurred, and my body trembled from the sheer effort of returning to life. I was alive, yet I wasn't the same person I had been. I understood why I had come back to warn you. The world is shifting, is. A momentous choice is looming, one that transcends mere survival. It's a test of faith. I've witnessed what lies ahead, the fate of those who yield and the resilience of those who hold firm. Jesus is coming soon. When that time arrives, there will be no middle ground, only a clear choice. Will you remain steadfast, or will you surrender? The time to choose is now.